The fluorescent lights of the grocery store hummed overhead as Sarah counted the crumpled bills in her wallet for the third time, her hands trembling slightly. $23.47. That's all that stood between her 8-month-old daughter Emma and another sleepless night of hunger. She looked down at the formula canister in her cart, then at the price tag that might as well have been written in gold. Her throat tightened as she realized she'd have to choose between feeding Emma tonight or keeping the lights on for another week. Behind her in line, Marcus Wellington adjusted his Italian leather jacket and checked his Rolex impatiently. The tech mogul had built his empire from nothing, transforming a small software company into a billion-dollar corporation. At 42, he commanded boardrooms, flew private jets, and owned homes on 3 continents. But tonight, he just wanted to grab his usual organic dinner and wine selection and get back to his penthouse to review quarterly projections. Sarah's shoulders sagged as she quietly lifted the formula from her cart and placed it back on the nearby shelf. The cashier, a kind-faced woman in her 50s named Betty, pretended not to notice the tears welling in the young mother's eyes. "Just the bread and peanut butter tonight," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the store's background music. Marcus watched this small drama unfold with growing curiosity. He'd seen desperation before in business negotiations, hostile takeovers, and corporate battles. But this was different. This was raw, unfiltered human struggle playing out in aisle 7 of a suburban grocery store. Something about the woman's quiet dignity as she made an impossible choice stirred something deep within him that years of wealth had nearly silenced. As Sarah gathered her meager groceries and headed toward the exit, Marcus made an impulsive decision. He quickly paid for his items and followed her into the parking lot, maintaining a respectful distance. The November air bit through his expensive coat as he watched her load her groceries into a battered Honda Civic that had clearly seen better days. Sarah drove slowly through the residential neighborhoods, and Marcus followed, his conscience wrestling with his curiosity. Was he being intrusive? Probably. But something compelled him to understand this woman's story. Her car pulled into the driveway of a modest duplex where paint peeled from the shutters and a small garden struggled against the coming winter. Through her living room window, Marcus could see Sarah enter and immediately lift a baby from a worn couch. The child's cries pierced the quiet evening air. Sarah bounced Emma gently, whispering soothing words, but the baby's hunger was relentless. Marcus watched as Sarah opened the nearly empty formula container and mixed what appeared to be the last serving. The scene transported Marcus back 35 years to his own childhood. He remembered his mother, Maria, working 3 jobs to keep food on their table. He remembered the nights she went hungry so he and his sister could eat. He remembered the shame of free lunch programs and donated clothes. Those memories, buried under decades of success and luxury, came flooding back with unexpected force. The next morning, Marcus did something he hadn't done in years. He cancelled his meetings. Instead, he drove to the local family services office, then to the grocery store, and finally to a dozen other businesses in the area. By noon, he had gathered more information about Sarah Chen, a 26-year-old single mother who had been laid off from her job at a local manufacturing plant 3 months ago. Sarah had been surviving on unemployment benefits, but they barely covered rent and utilities. She had applied for government assistance but was caught in a bureaucratic maze that moved at glacial speed. Her parents lived across the country and were struggling financially themselves. Pride had prevented her from reaching out to local charities, and she had been quietly managing her desperation alone. That afternoon, Marcus stood at Sarah's door, no longer the intimidating billionaire who graced magazine covers. He was just a man who remembered what it felt like to be hungry. When Sarah answered, Emma balanced on her hip, her eyes widen in recognition and suspicion. "You were behind me in line yesterday," she said cautiously. "I was," Marcus replied. "My name is Marcus Wellington. I saw what happened at the store, and I couldn't stop thinking about it." Sarah's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "If you're here to make me feel worse about my situation, you can leave now." "Actually, I'm here because 35 years ago, my mother made the same choice you made yesterday. Many times." Marcus's voice carried a weight that made Sarah pause. "I'm here because I understand what it means to go without so your child doesn't have to." Over the next hour, sitting in Sarah's modest living room while Emma slept peacefully, Marcus shared his own story. He talked about growing up in Detroit, about his mother's sacrifices, about the shame and determination that had driven him to succeed. Sarah, initially guarded, found herself opening up about her struggles, her fears, and her fierce love for her daughter. "I don't want charity," Sarah said firmly when Marcus suggested he could help. "I want to work. I want to provide for myself." Marcus smiled, the first genuine smile he'd felt in months. What if it wasn't charity? What if it was an opportunity? The following Monday, Sarah started her new job as administrative coordinator at Wellington Tech's local office. The position came with full benefits, childcare assistance, and a salary that would allow her to rebuild her life with dignity. But Marcus's help didn't stop there. He established the Second Chances program within his company, specifically designed to help single parents who had fallen through society's cracks. The program provided not just employment, but also childcare, flexible schedules, and pathways for advancement. Sarah became the program's first success story, but she wouldn't be the last. 6 months later, at the program's first graduation ceremony, Sarah stood at the podium with Emma in her arms. The baby, now plump and healthy, gurgled happily as Sarah addressed the audience of employees, local officials, and other program participants. "Marcus Wellington followed me home that night, and it changed everything," she said, her voice strong and clear. "Not because he's wealthy, but because he remembered what it felt like to be poor. He saw me not as someone to pity, but as someone with potential who just needed a chance." Marcus sat in the back row, thinking about the quarterly reports that remain unreviewed and the board meetings he'd rescheduled. None of it seemed important compared to the 23 families that now had steady incomes and hope for the future. After the ceremony, as Marcus walked to his car, Betty from the grocery store approached him. She had been invited as the person who had first witnessed the interaction that started everything. "You know," she said, "I've been working that register for 15 years. I've seen a lot of people make hard choices, but I've never seen someone follow up on their compassion like you did." Marcus looked back at the building where the celebration continued. Through the windows, he could see Sarah laughing with other program participants while Emma played with the other children. The sight filled him with a satisfaction that no business success had ever matched. "I think," Marcus said quietly, "I'm finally learning what wealth is really for." As he drove home that evening, Marcus realized that following Sarah that November night hadn't just changed her life, it had saved his own soul. In a world that often feels divided by circumstances and class, sometimes it takes one person's quiet courage and another's remembered compassion to remind us that we're all more alike than different. Sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is simply pay attention to someone else's struggle and choose to act. The formula that Sarah couldn't afford that night cost $12.99. The program Marcus created in response has now helped over 500 families. But the real transformation, the one that turned a billionaire's heart back toward humanity, was priceless.